Hi, everybody. I'm Siva Vaidyanathan. I'm a media studies professor at the University of Virginia, and it's my pleasure to host this conversation about the movie The Social Network. We are here at basically the 10th anniversary of this film. And I've noticed teaching about Facebook, talking about Facebook in a variety of forums over the past decade, this film is impossible to ignore. It dominates what people think about Facebook. It dominates what people think about Mark Zuckerberg. It's really hard to tell a story that might not track with this movie. So we put together a panel today of people who have a lot of insight into Facebook and into Mark Zuckerberg and into Facebook's influence on the world. And I think it's going to be a really good conversation. We will get to a lot of the discussion about what the movie actually does right, a bit about what it does wrong. But we'll mostly talk about Facebook because Facebook is such a dominant thing in our lives. And to frame that, let me emphasize, Facebook has 2.7 billion users, and they use Facebook regularly in more than 110 languages around the world. That is a stunning amount of reach. We have never seen a company, we've never seen a media platform reach that many people and have that depth of influence over social relations, political relations, cultural issues. It's really something we're only just now starting to understand. And we're joined today by two people who have been a great help in our efforts to understand this company and its effect on the world. We're going to hear from Roger McNamee, who was one of the early funders of Facebook and a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. He has since realized the extent to which Facebook causes damage in the world and has been a very vocal and informed and engaged critic of Facebook, with a lot of authority, of course, from his previous experience. And then Yael Eisenstadt, who is currently a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech in New York City. And in 2018, she was the head of global election integrity for global ads. So she worked at Facebook and got to see it from the inside, and she was hired to make Facebook a little bit better to the world. So we'll see how that turned out. So this film, as I said, is 10 years old. Roger, would you mind telling us a bit about what it was like to know Mark Zuckerberg 10 years ago?
So when I first met Mark, it was in the middle of 2006. He had just turned 22. The company was about 2 years old. And relative to the film, it's a month or two after the end of the timeline of the Social Network film. So I knew the Mark of that film. And my experience with him was actually quite different from the one in the film. But what I will tell you is when I did see the film, finally, all those pieces were there. It's just our relationship was different. So imagine this. I get a phone call on a Friday morning from the head of privacy at Facebook, a guy I barely knew, says, my boss is facing a crisis. And he needs to talk to somebody who can be objective and can keep their mouth shut. Will you take a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg? Now, here's the framing. This is Facebook before Newsfeed. This is Facebook when it's only college students and high school students. I had never used the product, but I was already convinced before I met him that it was going to crack the code and be the first important social network. Because unlike everything before it, Facebook had two things that I thought mattered. First, it required real identity. You had to use your school email account to sign up. And secondly, it was the first social network to give you some control over privacy. I was convinced that was going to allow the product not just to be successful, but to be particularly dominant with older people. That people whose time was scarce, right? We're going to use this, and sharing photographs and things like that were going to be a really big deal. And again, keep in mind, when I first met him, it's before Newsfeed. So it's a very primitive product. I'm excited to take the meeting. And I say, well, sure, next week I'm pretty open Wednesday to Thursday. He says, how about 1 o'clock this afternoon? I went, it's that important? He goes, no, this is urgent. We have to do it today. So I take the meeting. He comes to my office, and you won't even believe this. He walks in. and he looks just like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, he's got the sandals, he's got the skinny jeans, he's got the gray t-shirt, the gray hoodie, the Caesar Augustus haircut. He comes into my office, and I was running a fund in those days with a rock star named Bono. And we had an office that had one conference room set up as a living room with video game things all over the place. So he and I go in there, just the two of us in this room, in comfy chairs, no desk, no table. He's sitting 3 feet from me. And I say, Mark, before you say a word, I have to tell you why I took this meeting. I think you have broken the code, and you're going to do something no one else has ever done before you. But if it has not already happened, either Microsoft or Yahoo is going to offer $1 billion to buy Facebook. And everyone you know, your parents, your friends, your board of directors, your investors, your employees, your partners, they're all going to tell you, Mark, take the money. You're going to have $650 million. You can change the world. Your venture capitalists will promise he'll back your next company. It'll be much more important than Facebook. I'm saying, Mark, I've been doing this 24 years. There are two things I know for sure. One is that no entrepreneur, not Steve Jobs, not anybody, had the perfect idea at the perfect time twice. You have the perfect idea at the perfect time. The second thing I know is that if you sell this, I don't care who you sell it to, but especially Microsoft and Yahoo, they will kill it. So if you believe in this vision, you have to carry it yourself. Now, what followed this was, for me, the strangest experience I've ever had in a business meeting, but it shows a side of Mark Zuckerberg you do not see in the movie. I've never met the guy. That's literally the first thing out of my mouth after I've met him. So I'm expecting some kind of feedback. What do I get? I get a thinker pose. That goes on for about a minute. If you've ever sat with somebody silent in a room after you said something important and they don't say anything for a minute, it's really uncomfortable. At the 1 minute mark, he changes thinker poses. Nothing happens. I'm going, this is really weird. But in the back of my head, I'm also going, wow, this is also a sign of respect. He is really thinking about what I said. This goes on 3 minutes, 4 minutes. I'm literally digging holes in the upholstery of the seat I'm in because I'm witnessing literally a world record silence. If I say something, I'm going to blow it, so I can't do anything. I'm literally stuck in the situation. Finally, in the 5th minute, he visibly relaxes and he goes, you're not even going to believe this. Now, I'll tell you this. At that point, I would have believed anything. But he goes, that story you just told, that's why I'm here. That exact thing has just happened. Yahoo's offered $1 billion. Everybody's told me to take it. And I go, well, what do you want? And he goes, I don't want to sell the company. I think I'm the right person to lead it forward. I have this vision. So I go, well, let's talk about how your charter works, because maybe you have something. Well, it turned out he actually had control of the situation. They couldn't sell it out from under him, but he felt like he couldn't fight them. I'm going, Mark, it's not how it works. You've achieved every milestone you set out to do. No investor has the right to tell you to sell the company at this point because you've delivered your promises. It's going really well. And you've got a vision that is morally sound. You've got privacy. You've got real identity. These are really, if you can scale those things, you're going to create something really positive. The whole meeting lasted 30 minutes. He goes back, blows up the M&A deal, and calls me up like the next day over the weekend, invites me into the office on Monday. And that starts a period of about 3 years where I saw him almost every week. And my job was very simple. He had to rebuild his management team because everybody wanted to sell. They didn't believe in the vision.
Right.
And the thing I'm going to burn in hell for forever is that it was my idea to bring Sheryl Sandberg in, and I talked her into taking the media team into that whole thing. And so, the great Harvard scholar Shoshana Zuboff describes Sheryl as the typhoid Mary of the internet, which makes me the Uber driver for typhoid Mary of the internet.
Right.
Because first I got her into Google, and then I get her into
yeah. So, but there was a moment when you actually defined Zuckerberg's contribution as one in which he had what you said was the moral formula, right? that he was committed to privacy protection and to real identity, neither of which actually worked out very well over time.
No, in fact, the real identity turned out to be, and I believe I got this originally from your book, I think you may have had it, that Sean Parker describes it later as it was simply the way to implement graph theory
Right.
network. And it was just wildly more cost effective to use real identity. And the thing was, once they got their hands on enough capital that they were insensitive to the incremental cost of adding users,
Yeah.
they abandoned that thing completely.
Sure.
They didn't announce it. They didn't say it. They pretended that identity still mattered.
Yeah.
The privacy thing, I think deep down underneath, he never believed in privacy. And I think the privacy thing was there at the beginning because of, again, a convenience thing that, somebody had said something, and giving people the appearance that they control privacy was valuable.
It was important with the moral panic about young people and social media and MySpace and all that at the time. So when this film came out, The Social Network, 10 years ago, you would have gone to see it. And
I didn't know. Here's the problem. I had a personal relationship with Mark. I had just, he outgrew me. And by 2009, with Cheryl fully on board,
yeah.
the thing that I did was done. And so we kept talking for another 6 months. But realistically, all great CEOs, they have to change their mentors according to the needs of the time. And my role, and this was the sort of thing where I could see it before he did. Okay. And I'm going, look, dude, you don't need me anymore. And that's cool. Okay. Well, and he goes, yeah, we'll always be friends, which didn't turn out to be true. But Steve, here's the core thing. I didn't go see it because I thought my understanding of Mark was the correct one, but my understanding was incomplete. He and I didn't socialize. I was 2.5 times his age. Right. And we didn't socialize. I saw him in this narrow context. And the thing was, he was precociously mature about business issues. He had a clear sense. I mean, his ability to listen. Think about that first meeting.
Right.
How many CEOs do you meet who take the time to actually listen to something that they're uncomfortable with? I mean, honest to God, I never met anybody who was a better listener in that context than he was. Again, what I didn't realize was that there are plenty of contexts where he doesn't listen at all. And what I came to realize, what I came to appreciate, and it really wasn't until a few years after I stopped being involved with Facebook, was that Mark had a vision of connecting the whole world on one network that he controlled and he set the rules of. And in his mind, that was the most important thing any human being could do. Right. And that, if you will, he was allowed to run experiments with disastrous consequences because the end justified the means. And so to me, what really, and this is about the time you and I met, I think, when the Myanmar genocide occurred.
Yeah.
That was the moment where I realized that this company was more like a cult than it was like a business.
Interesting.
That the notion that not one employee spoke out after Myanmar.
Yeah.
When the United Nations said that Facebook was singularly responsible for enabling that genocide, I just sat there going, oh my God. Because so the other piece of the story that's worth mentioning here, in early 2016, I start to see inauthentic behavior, the spread of hate speech from Facebook groups.
Right.
And then I see civil rights violations relative to Black Lives Matter, and then finally Brexit. And it's with Brexit that the light bulb goes off. And I realize, oh my God, the ad tools,
yeah,
they're so powerful for advertisers, can be used to distort the outcome of an election.
Yeah.
And I reach out to Mark and Cheryl in October of 2016. So it's before the election, and I'm reaching out as their former mentor and their friend. And I'm going, guys, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but there is something about the business model, the algorithms, and the culture of Facebook that is allowing bad actors to harm innocent people. And I give them a list, very specific list of examples. And I do this very quietly. I was invited to write an op-ed for Recode, which I never published. I sent it to Mark and Cheryl instead and initiated a 3-month conversation that starts before the election. So I'm not even talking about Trump. I'm just talking about all this other stuff. And then Trump gets elected. And I'm going, oh my God, even if you guys don't believe there's a moral argument here, your business is based on trust. If people think that you're undermining civil rights and democracy, that's going to be bad. Don't go there. I'm being your mentor here, right? I'm not hostile. And for 3 months, they literally give me the same song and dance you read in the paper all the time, which is, Roger, we've studied this stuff and, none of this is systemic and we've fixed it and we'll try to do better next time, right? And the same nonsense we hear over and over and over again. And the critical thing to understand is that this comes from having a different value system. So, inside their value system, they're behaving in a perfectly appropriate way.
Yeah.
And if we could all debate whether that value system was legitimate or not, then that would be fine if they could convince us. But it's this notion of imposing a value system without including us in the conversation. The same thing that Google has done with Google Maps and Gmail and now, Pokemon Go and then Sidewalk Labs.
Right.
It's this notion that somehow they are entitled to impose their worldview on everyone else.
Right. Well, Roger described the life work at Facebook to be something like a cult. You actually were working with the cult. I don't know if you subscribed to the cult, but you certainly were interested in being part of the mission and making a difference there. So what attracted you to Facebook? What inspired you to try to make a difference there? And then what was that experience like?
Sure. Thanks again for bringing us all together for this conversation. It's interesting. Facebook for me, it is a product that I used. I still use, just very limited now. But I had lived and worked all over the world. I used to be a diplomat. My friends were spread out across the world. Facebook was the way that I was in touch with all of them. It was an amazing tool for that, right? I mean, in early days for me, it was sharing photos and silly comments. I never used it for sharing news or for consuming news, but it was a fun platform and I enjoyed it. Similar to Roger, a similar timeline, it was early 2016 that I started really digging in and thinking something was wrong here. I had spent my whole life in the national security world and most of my career overseas. And I started focusing on this breakdown in civil discourse in the US. And this was before the election. Actually, it was in 2015, I started looking at it and thinking, you know what, this to me is the biggest threat to democracy that I can see coming, is this breakdown in civil discourse and this like tribal factioning of Americans. And as someone who's focused on the whole world, focusing on the US was a whole new thing for me. And so I started writing and I wrote this piece about it, and I didn't pin it all on Facebook at the time. And I still don't today. I mean, there's a lot of actors in this, but I did point out that social media very clearly seems to both have a huge role in playing in how we're talking to each other and could be a force for good or for bad, depending on the direction they choose to keep going. And so when the Cambridge Analytica scandal became public and all of a sudden there was more and more news about Facebook, that's when they started calling me. And to this day, I don't know if they called me because someone referred me or because I was keynoting these tech conferences, and I don't know why, but I was speaking a lot about how social media and the way you engage online is fundamentally antithetical to reasoned discourse and civil discourse and all the things that I care about. So they called me and they made the final offer 1 minute after the famous Senate hearing ended, the one where Zuckerberg did the whole, yes, Senator, we sell ads. Yeah. And they offered me this role. It was a new role. It didn't exist. The big shiny title was head of global elections integrity ops for political ads. It's a mouthful. But essentially, the way the recruiter sold it to me was that I would be helping the company really build new operational plans for what they're going to do about political advertising. I mean, that was really the nuts and bolts around the world.
Right.
Which in and of itself, there shouldn't be one person you're hiring for that. But that's part of the problem, right? It's this, we can come up with a solution and scale it to the whole world. Well, no, you can't, but we'll get to that, I'm sure, later in the conversation. So I went in, listen, I wasn't naive. I was very clear during the interviews, not just with the recruiters, but with each person I met with at Facebook. Do not hire me if you want someone who is X, Y, or Z. Like, you know what's interesting? In the original job description for the role they were originally interviewing me for, which was similar, but just a slightly different role, it was like all these things about being able to see around the corner and anticipate the future risks and figure out who's trying to manipulate the platform. In the requirements, they were looking for someone with an engineering, math, or like some other technical degree.
Cookie cutter ad.
And I said to the recruiter, I was like, how does someone with an engineering degree, how is that the person you want helping figure out how global actors are going to manipulate your platform for political purposes? Like, just think about that. Even then in 2018, that's what the job description said. Anyway, so getting back to the cult. So they brought me in. I was very clear on hire me if you mean it, don't if you don't. I am a former national security officer. I'm going to look under the rugs. I'm going to really try to understand how did we get here in order to understand how do we fix it. Day one was just like you guys said. It felt a little cultish. It was very exciting. And it was like, felt like this indoctrination, this never ending, this is your company now. You own this. This is all about you. And we got fancy omelets for breakfast and we got all the snacks we wanted and everybody was just very excited. And I even got caught up in it for like a minute. But again, I had like an 18-year career behind me. I was like working in really like in national security issues. I perhaps didn't fall quite as easily for it. But anyway, yeah. So on day two, it all kind of ended. That excitement ended because on day two, my manager had her first call with me because I was based out of New York, but I was in Menlo Park at that point, and she's based out of Austin, and just told me, we're changing your title, and started talking about how my job description was going to change. And this is what's interesting. Like, that just seemed totally acceptable within Facebook. Like, it just seemed totally acceptable to bring someone with my background. And as much as people love to act like I don't have the right to have this platform because who am I? I'm not an engineer. Yeah, I did though spend 18 years working around the world on some of our toughest national security issues. But to them, it was totally normal. I should just accept that we hired you with this promise yesterday, but today you're being basically demoted. You're now just a manager, and we're going to kind of figure out what you're going to do. So that's about how seriously they took that. But the biggest answer to this question, because I'm sorry, I realize I'm going on a bit long, is there are lots of different angles we can look at this problem. But one is a culture problem, and it's one that I don't talk about a lot. And so let's focus on the culture problem since we're talking about the movie right now. And it's that you have to fundamentally so incredibly believe that you are having a huge impact in the world and you have the most important job in the world and you are making the world a better place with your product in order to continue to work under a situation where, wait a minute, did I hear that maybe we contributed to a genocide? Wait a minute. Did I hear that maybe we helped sway this election? No, it can't be, because our product is fundamentally connecting the world. And if you're willing to start to pull away and say, maybe the thing we built isn't the best thing for society, then you have two choices. Either you continue down that path knowingly contributing to terrible things in the world, or you decide you're going to retool the entire thing you built to begin with. Well, I never saw B, I only saw A. I never saw people go, can we stop for a minute and think? Like, I asked very senior level people there, have you ever stopped and just asked, who do we want to be in the world? And every time they said no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cognitive dissonance is clear, and you can see it and hear it when Mark Zuckerberg talks about, as he did a year ago, about how, well, the idea of blocking content that denies the Holocaust is out of the question, because of course we want people to be wrong. We want people to be free to be wrong, as if there's no harm attached to that sort of propaganda, as if there isn't an agenda, a violent agenda at the heart. So this notion that all that happens on Facebook is ethereal, all that happens on Facebook is disconnected from the world he thinks is so connected. And now that he's having to face perhaps policy and political repercussions, if not an outright revolt among many of his employees, because they seem to have broken out of the cult to some degree in the past year. There have been enough people who've resigned in protest. There have been enough people who've spoken out. There have been enough internal meetings at Facebook in the last year that have shown that at least some of them are reading what we write and listening to what we say and asking the very question, Yael, that you hoped that the senior people would ask. So at least the mid-level people and below are asking that question, some of them. And that's a fascinating turn of events. So as of last week, or I guess earlier this week, Holocaust denial material is now forbidden on Facebook, as far as I can tell.
Can I make a point on that one? Actually, that would be like a perfect last point for me to make before kicking it back to Roger, is the Holocaust denial question.
Yeah.
I mean, two things. First of all, when the movie came out, when we're talking about the social network, Facebook was in its baby years, right? Yep. It's child. One of the things, I know nobody said this, but I just want to make really clear. There's so many people who continue to use the excuse, oh, but the internet's still so young. Oh, but Facebook's in its, I don't know, teenage years. And my answer to that is when you intentionally decide that you are going to do everything in your power to be the most powerful platform in the world, and you do everything you can to make sure that you will be the dominant force in how 3 billion people communicate with each other, you grow up. You're not a teenager. You are an adult. There are adult consequences. But on the Holocaust denial one, it's a perfect way for me to kind of wrap my thoughts up into a nice little bow here. So Mark Zuckerberg finally said that Facebook will no longer allow Holocaust denial on its platform, which is interesting because they've already had all sorts of policies on other kind of hate speech, but for some reason, Holocaust denial didn't fit into the rest of them, despite major organizations, not just people like me screaming. They like to just think I'm a person screaming. The Anti-Defamation League, 100 years old. They are the forefront of this. They've been telling Facebook this for years. Other organizations around the world have been saying Holocaust denial is not just about free speech. Holocaust denial is an actual tactic it's a tactic of anti-Semitism to encourage hate and potential attacks. And despite all the real experts telling Mark Zuckerberg this for years, he dug his heels in. And he dug his heels in because to him, I am going to continue to claim that more speech is better than bad speech or whatever. So what changed? Because now he says this whole thing about my thinking has evolved because I've seen data. Excuse me, but if you think that your Facebook data is somehow better, smarter, and more relevant than what dozens of hate organizations, including some of the oldest and most established in the world, is better, then you have a fundamental lack of respect for the way other experts who work on these issues think and talk about things. And Holocaust denial was a perfect example of being in this bubble of tunnel vision of, but I'm right, and free speech is all that matters, and you haven't proven to me that Holocaust denial is a bad thing or my platform's contributing to it. And that's why I don't think that under Mark Zuckerberg's leadership, Facebook is ever going to become a company that truly understands that for all the good it's doing in the world, there are very real consequences as well.
And believe me, we know it all too well here in Charlottesville. We saw it in our streets, and we continue to suffer the bruises from that. It's also striking that, I mean, what more data do you need than the Holocaust itself? I mean, that seems to be a pretty data-rich experience right there. And you don't really need a computer system to figure out how to do all you can to minimize that sort of threat. But the interesting thing to me about the Holocaust denial policy change of late 2020 is, just like with so many other policy changes, it seems to me to be only in English. And I keep asking reporters to ask people at Facebook, is this a change that will apply in Arabic? Is this a change that will apply in Farsi? Right? These are
Great questions.
And is it a change that will apply to the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar? Will it apply to the Armenian genocide from Turkey? Because those remain. I mean, there is a federal election in Rohingya in Myanmar the same week as our election, and this is an actual issue. And I don't know if Facebook has anyone in the ground yet.
I'm sure.
Myanmar, right?
Well, and I mean, this is a really fascinating thing, because we heard from both of you the extent to which there is this sense that the Facebook influence on the world and the Facebook worldview is universalizing, it's totalizing, it's grand, it's global. And yet there seems to be no real sensitivity to specificity, to difference, to historical contingency, to the varieties of human cruelty that are possible out there. It's as if everybody in the world is an educated, cosmopolitan, wealthy, white person living in Northern California and can reason their way through questions that seem completely theoretical, like the extent of the Holocaust, rather than, or the dangers of, or lack thereof, of vaccines, right? These are real world issues with real consequences where people get hurt and die. And yet it all seems like it's in a seminar room to this culture. Now, the film that we're talking about here is very much about culture. It's about a boy culture, a masculinist culture that dominated the early days of Facebook. And so much of the story, which I think is an inaccurate story, has to do with Zuckerberg's own motivation for starting the company and his own motivation for a will to power. Roger, what can you say about that masculinist culture? You've lived in it and among it. You've had to roll your eyes and worse at all sorts of experiences there, not just at Facebook, but in Silicon Valley in general. Is there a sense now? Is there a sense that maybe that boys' culture has been the source of so much of this trouble?
So the answer is, I think it's a huge factor. And the thing people should understand is that film, which is about 2004 to 2006, is at exactly the inflection point when the culture of Silicon Valley began to change from the sort of Steve Jobs, Apollo moon landing value system of using technology to empower people,
right,
to a very predatory model. The big difference was that before 2004, the limitations on processing power, memory, storage, and bandwidth were so extreme that every tech company had to listen really carefully to its customers to do the one thing the customer wanted, because they could only do one thing at a time. Beginning in 2004, all the limits came off. By 2010, you could watch a film on a smartphone. So all the limits were gone. So you no longer had to listen to customers. You could create global products and impose a value system on people. Google was the first to catch on to this, and Professor Zuboff in her book really documents, beginning in 2000, how Google began this notion of using surveillance, massive data gathering, to both forecast, anticipate people's desires, and just as importantly, use control of menus to manipulate behavior. Right. And at Google, that starts 2000, 2001. At Facebook, that really doesn't kick in until about 2013. And the reason is that Facebook product was architected differently. And Google had all these point products doing one function at a time. They were either in the business of gathering data or in the business of manipulating behavior, and they would trade data from one piece to another in order to pull that off. Facebook was this one giant thing. And it took them a long time to be able to have enough data to actually have a business model where the ads were worth anything. But the essential premise throughout, from the very beginning, was that they were right and that their vision justified whatever it took to get there. And this is this is foreshadowed in that movie, I think, really beautifully. So in the movie, it has to do with, the co-founders and the way they were treated. But take a look at anyone who's ever partnered with Facebook. They are always roadkill within a few years of partnering with Facebook.
Yeah.
And if you look at governments, I mean, Zuckerberg has ignored subpoenas from the government of the United Kingdom and the government of Canada, 2 of his top 5 markets in the world, right? I mean, this is unbelievable. He defied a subpoena from Congress for a while. And, it is this notion in Mark's mind. Facebook in aggregate, including Instagram and WhatsApp, has roughly 3 billion active users. So it's twice as big as China. It's bigger than Christianity. He views Facebook like a sovereign nation that should not be beholden to anyone. And what's so astonishing, I mean, we're watching this film today with the benefit of having seen over the last 30 days more movement behaviorally by Facebook in response to external pressure than in the prior 15 years put together. In the space of roughly 10 days, Facebook is essentially triggered, I believe, by the House Antitrust Subcommittee's conclusion that Facebook was a monopoly, but also the pressure from Stop Hate for Profit, the real Facebook Oversight Board, and people like yourselves, both Yael and Siva, and all the other activists who've been out there talking about this, that the combined weight of those things, and probably an awareness that the election was not going to come down the way they were hoping it was going to, that those things collectively have shifted the calculus, that Mark Zuckerberg now looks at the world and says, wow, I may not in fact have as much control as I want. The other answer to your question, Siva, is that they consciously know nothing about history. So from their point of view, essentially, time began when Facebook was started, and nothing else matters. And that the framework that they're creating is the new world.
Like Pol Pot, it's year 0.
Exactly, right? But not the only thing. I mean, Professor Timothy Snyder talks about this in the battle between fascism and democracy. The problem with the democratic states was they viewed the future as inevitable. We were always going to get better, which made them incredibly disrespectful of history, because it didn't matter. If you're always going to get better, what did history matter? And so we got lazy and made ourselves vulnerable to fascism. And if you think about Facebook and Google, what you realize is they are autocratic corporations. They have absolute control. Shareholders have no voice. Governments have been unable to move them. That the processes governments use to regulate other companies are scaled too small to have any impact.
Yeah.
So these companies naturally wind up aligning themselves with autocrats. So if you look at this, you see them bending over backwards to be tight with, whether it's the government of the Philippines or the government of Cambodia or with Trump. Whereas look at democratic countries, right? They flip a bird to Canada, right? I mean, they basically ignored New Zealand after the Christchurch terrorism.
Yeah.
There's still copies of that film up, even though it's against the law in New Zealand, but they don't care. And why is that, right? I mean, it's a different value system, and it doesn't have to be that way. The tech industry does not have to be predatory. I mean, there is no reason we cannot relaunch a tech industry. This is why regulation matters, why antitrust, why safety regulations, why privacy regulations matter. I mean, think about safety. Software engineers and tech engineers are unique in the engineering world of not having any accountability for the consequences of their action. If you build a building and it hurts somebody, if it falls down, you are personally liable. If you make a pharmaceutical and it kills people, you are liable. If you make a chemical or you spill a chemical, you are liable. But if you destroy democracy, if you undermine a pandemic response so hundreds of thousands of people die unnecessarily, there is no accountability at all. You trigger a genocide. There's none at all. And that has to change. And that's going to be the beginning of a great thing, right? That's not it's something to be feared. That is something to be embraced. And that is the moment that may be beginning right now.
Well, Yael, can you close us out with a sense of what you think is possible in the next 5 years? Can Facebook be fixed? Can Facebook take the turn? Is there sufficient pressure, sufficient leadership? What do you think is possible?
Sure. I'm going to try to do this really quickly because unfortunately I actually have to get going. So I'll start by saying, normally I'm not the type of person who plugs something I already did, but if you want to hear exactly what I think about everything Roger just said in terms of responsibility and where that lies, it's all in a talk I just put out. So listen, this is a really polarizing conversation when it comes to how to regulate this. And it's interesting. It's more polarizing than any of the other things I've taken part in, including like counterterrorism issues, counter-extremism issues. And I think it's for lots of reasons. But one I'll say is because since the beginning of the internet, the tech companies have really benefited from absolute freedom to test, experiment, grow, scale, do whatever the heck they want. And because it's not just that there's no laws, they actually have the whole immunity and what one would call, a subsidy, basically, to continue to do all that they're doing with no responsibility. And yes, I mean, for the most extreme cases, of course, like where they're really breaking the law, intellectual property, things like that, and they're quite good at taking care of that. Just what's going to be really difficult is pushing the needle on the conversation, because the reason it's so polarizing is at the end of the day, I think there's a whole generation of people who work in the tech industry who've been indoctrinated to believe that the government doing anything is the absolute worst thing possible. And they don't stop to question, who is it that's indoctrinated you to believe that, though? Is it the leaders of these tech industries who, to them, it is the 100% benefit to make sure the government doesn't get involved? And so trying to kind of counter some of that narrative of, I don't think this is about speech. I don't think this is about content moderation. I don't think this is about who should I take down and who should I leave up. I think this is a higher question of, what do we want to have a healthier information ecosystem? Where do we want that to stand? And then how do we work to get there? I do think it's possible. I don't think there's any one quick solution and everybody wants a quick fix. Right. I think it's a combination of, there's very good arguments in the antitrust arguments. There's very good arguments in how to rethink some of Section 230. I don't expect anyone to necessarily follow me on that right now, and there's very good arguments for data privacy. No one of these things fixes everything. That said, the more movies and critics and academics and journalists are helping the public see that it matters, the more the public puts pressure on government to get their act together and think about, how do we protect our citizens against the externalities being caused by some of these companies? I think it's possible. I don't think it's possible in this extreme hyperpolarized world, which, by the way, Facebook does contribute to this hyperpolarized world. But I know that if I didn't think it was possible, I would have just gone and opened a bakery and stopped spending all my time talking about it. So I'll just end it with that.
Yeah. Hey, Stephen, can I add one thought to that? Because I really strongly agree with what Yael said, and I want to give people a little context, which is explicitly the business model is based on grabbing and holding our attention, because they compete with every other form of media out there. The difference is, by collecting all this data, by having a data voodoo doll on each one of us, which is the complete representation of our lives in the digital domain, they can create a Truman Show for each and every one of us individually. And what is the goal? The goal is to animate us emotionally. The most reliable content for that is the stuff that triggers flight or fight, our self-preservation instinct. What is that? Hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories do that better than anything. So the thing to understand is that hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories are not an incidental byproduct. Right. They are, in fact, the lubricant for the entire model. And so if you're going to reform these guys, throwing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of moderators isn't going to solve the problem. The only way to solve the problem is to force changes in the underlying business model so that it is not okay to amplify. Again, this is not a free speech issue. This is about amplification of hate. It's about amplification of disinformation and conspiracy theories. It is about the fact that they've admitted to at least 3 million members of QAnon on Facebook, of which 2 million were pushed into it by Facebook themselves, because 64% of the people who join extremist groups on Facebook do so because Facebook pushed them into it. Now, they do that for profit. That should not be okay. And to me, it shouldn't be about left or right. You know, it's like no one but people at Facebook benefits from this.
Right.
And so my hope is that this, in fact, becomes a depolarizing event. And you do see this, the role Facebook played in QAnon, the role it played in COVID denial are out there in front of everybody. And the role that they're playing in white supremacy terrorists, right, post George Floyd, those are things they can't hide from, that, knock wood, will help to cause everybody to go, wait a minute, they're one of the problems.
Right. Well, thank you.
We'll never do climate change. We'll never do any of the things that matters as long as they're allowed to distort politics.
Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Yael. This film is about an innocent time, perhaps some not so innocent young men. What they created was beyond anything anyone predicted or could have imagined at that moment. And now we're living with it in 2020. We are living in Facebook's world. Thank you so much for all the work you do and for the time you've given us today. And I hope we can all see each other in real life, in real space, sometime soon.
Until then, everyone should read The Antisocial Network. It is a fantastic book, okay?
Thank you.
Or Antisocial Media, excuse me. I'll look at the title right.
Thank you very much. Thanks. All right. See you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.